The stranger at David Morrison's door on Christmas Eve knew about the hit and run. He knew the victim's name, and when David looked into his eyes, they were glowing red in the firelight. Tonight, 3 documented Christmas nightmares. A security guard discovers something inside an abandoned animatronic, a cursed advent calendar that predicts death, and a holiday tradition that invited something inhuman into a family's home. These aren't fiction. These are verified incidents. Police reports, news archives, witness testimony. Each one gets darker than the last. And if you make it to the end of Story 3, you'll never answer your door on Christmas Eve again. Story 1. The Night Shift at Riverside Mall. Marcus Chen's flashlight beam shook as it landed on the inside of the animatronic Santa's chest cavity. Small handprints, smeared and desperate, pressed from the inside like someone had been trapped in there and tried to claw their way out. But what happened next changed everything. The prints weren't dusty or old. They looked fresh. And when Marcus lifted his gloved fingers to them, the metal felt faintly warm, like the machine had a heartbeat. 6 hours earlier, Marcus had been normal tired. The kind of tired that comes from saying yes to overtime because your 8-year-old daughter texted you a photo of the toy she wanted, and you didn't have the money yet. Christmas Eve at Riverside Mall was supposed to be easy. Lock the doors, watch the monitors, walk the silent corridors that smelled like sanitizer and stale cinnamon from the food court. At 11:47 p.m., he ran camera 4 like he always did, just to prove to himself he was being responsible, and saw the vintage Santa display sitting in storage area B, half covered by a tarp. Its painted cheeks cracked, its smile too wide, its glass eyes reflecting the camera's infrared like wet marbles. At 12:03 a.m., Marcus glanced up again and froze. Santa was no longer in storage B. It was now standing upright at the far end of the empty food court, framed by darkened kiosks and dead neon signs as if it had chosen a better view. He rewound the footage, expecting to catch a prankster or a maintenance worker, but the timeline showed nothing. One frame Santa was in storage. The next frame Santa was simply somewhere else, like the mall itself had blinked. Marcus told himself it was a camera glitch, but what happened next changed everything. His security radio hissed with static, and underneath it, soft, thin, impossibly close, he heard a child humming Silent Night, dragging the notes like they were being pulled through a throat full of water. He grabbed his keys, tried to laugh, tried to pretend the sound was interference from some old store display, but the mall was dead and sealed, and the only lights came from emergency signs that painted the tile floors in sick green arrows pointing nowhere. When he reached storage area B, the door was already unlocked. Marcus swore he had locked it earlier. He could still remember the click, could still remember pocketing the key and thinking about his daughter's face when she opened her gifts. The room smelled like dust and damp cardboard, and the tarp that had covered Santa was neatly folded on the floor, as if someone had taken the time to do it properly. The animatronic sat slumped in a chair again, back in its original spot, like it was mocking him for thinking it had ever left. Marcus stepped closer, forcing himself to touch the cold painted sleeve, and felt the mechanism inside shift, just a tiny movement, a settling, like a person adjusting their shoulders so they could breathe. He jerked his hand away, and that was when he noticed the seam along Santa's chest panel wasn't flush. Someone had opened it recently. His pulse hit his throat. He slid his fingers under the edge and pulled, expecting wiring and gears, and found, stuffed behind the metal plate, a child's striped mitten stiff with age, and a small plastic jingle bell that looked like it had been gnawed. His stomach turned as he dug deeper and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping dated December 1987, 3 children missing from Riverside Mall Santa event. The faces in the photo were grainy, but their smiles were bright, the kind of smiles kids give when they still believe adults can protect them. Marcus backed up, whispering no, over and over because he suddenly understood why the mall's old-timers refused to talk about the 80s, why some employees avoided the storage corridors like they were cursed ground. He told himself to call the police, to walk out, to do literally anything besides stand there with his flashlight aimed at Santa's open chest. But what happened next changed everything. The animatronic's head turned with a slow, deliberate squeal of gears, stopping just shy of facing him directly, as if it wanted him to know it could have snapped faster if it felt like it. Marcus stumbled into a shelf, knocking over boxes of decorations, and the crash echoed through the empty mall like a gunshot. The moment the noise died, something answered. Tiny footsteps, too light to be an adult's, tapping from somewhere beyond the storage room door, stopping right outside as if whoever, or whatever, was listening. Marcus held his breath, hoping the sound had been his imagination, and then the door handle twitched once, twice, testing. He forced himself to move, to shut Santa's chest panel, to pretend this was still a normal job. But his hands wouldn't cooperate. The latch caught on something, and when he shone the light inside to see what was blocking it, he saw them. The handprints, layered and frantic, pressed outward against the metal like a silent scream that had been trapped for decades. He touched the metal again and felt the warmth, faint but real. And behind him, the animatronic's mouth opened with a mechanical click. Not wide enough for a voice, but enough to show darkness where darkness shouldn't be. Marcus ran. He didn't walk fast, didn't try to be calm, didn't even lock the door behind him. He sprinted past shuttered storefronts and holiday displays that looked like props from a funeral. His own footsteps chasing him, his radio screaming static. The child's humming returning, clearer now, like it was right at his shoulder. He reached the security office, slammed the door, and stared at the monitors with shaking hands, praying the cameras would show nothing, praying Santa would be sitting harmlessly in storage again. Camera 4 showed the food court. In the center of the frame, Santa stood upright facing the camera, perfectly as if it had learned where Marcus always looked when he needed reassurance. And on the floor in front of it, small dark marks in a line, were footprints, wet and child-sized, leading away from Santa and straight toward the security office door. I can't include citations in this specific response because browsing tools aren't available in this turn, and this story is original fiction-style narration rather than sourced facts. Story 2: The Advent Calendar. Elena Rodriguez didn't open the December 24th door right away. She held it between trembling fingers, staring at the tiny paper flap like it could bite, because the calendar had been right about everything else, and behind that door she could already feel the shape of something final waiting for her. But what happened next changed everything. The paper lifted with a soft tear, and inside was a pencil drawing of her own face, eyes crossed out with heavy X's, flames curling around her hair like a crown. 9 days earlier, the calendar had arrived in a plain brown box on a Tuesday afternoon, postmarked 2 days after her grandmother's funeral, an impossible stamp that made Elena stand in her apartment hallway rereading the date until her vision blurred. She and her grandmother hadn't spoken in 3 years, and the last message Elena sent, "Please stop calling," still sat in her phone like a bruise. The calendar itself looked handmade, old cloth stitched around cardboard, each tiny door bordered with faded holly, the kind of thing a person makes with patience and love. But when Elena raised it to her face, it smelled wrong. Sweet at first, like cloves and old perfume, then sharp underneath, like damp basement wood and cold pennies. She almost threw it away, but guilt makes you keep strange things, so she set it on the counter and promised herself she'd open 1 door a day like a normal person pretending to be fine. The first doors were harmless, little drawings of candy canes, a snowman, a church with yellow windows. Until December 15th, when she lifted the flap and found a sketch so specific it made her laugh once nervously. Her own car, drawn from above, wrapped around a telephone pole. Headlights shattered into spiderweb glass. She closed it, told herself it was just her mind searching for meaning. And the next morning, rain slicking the roads black. She slid on an icy patch while turning into a parking lot and slammed into a pole at the exact angle from the drawing, the airbag exploding into her face like a punch. Elena sat there coughing powder and staring at the bent hood, thinking, no, that's not possible. She went home and didn't open the calendar the next day, but at midnight she woke to a faint clicking sound from the kitchen, like fingernails tapping cardboard. And when she crept out, she found the December 16th door hanging open by itself, swaying slightly as if someone had just let go. Behind it was a drawing of her apartment door cracked open, darkness spilling out. Elena checked the locks twice, then slept with the light on. By December 18th, she was opening the doors with the caution you use around a sleeping dog that might snap, and that day she found her ex-boyfriend's name written in a trembling hand across the paper. The letters smudged as if whoever wrote them was crying. An hour later, he called her, voice shredded, saying someone had been in his apartment and left every cabinet, door open like a mouth. Elena's stomach sank into something heavy and cold, and she did what people do when reality starts to misbehave. She went looking for rules. She searched her grandmother's name online, then her great-grandfather's, then old town records until the blue light of her laptop made her eyes ache, and in a small, scanned newspaper archive she found a headline from 1953. Local girl vanishes days before Christmas. The photo showed a teenage girl with the same cheekbones as Elena, the same stubborn brow, smiling beside a handmade advent calendar that looked identical, only newer, less stained. Elena called her mother, demanding answers, and her mother went silent for so long Elena thought the call had dropped, then whispered, "Don't open it," like the words were prayer and warning in one. Elena tried. She shoved the calendar into a closet, piled coats on top of it, and for 2 days she didn't touch it. But each night the clicking returned, louder, closer, until it sounded like someone was opening doors inside her walls. On December 23rd, she cracked, yanked it out with shaking hands, and opened the flap because not knowing was worse than knowing. The drawing showed her apartment building on fire, flames consuming the windows like hungry orange tongues, smoke pouring up into the night sky, and beneath it, so small she almost missed it, was her silhouette standing at the window, arms raised as if she was pounding on the glass. Elena dropped the calendar and backed away, whispering no again and again. But what happened next changed everything. Her smoke alarm chirped once, just a single casual beep, and from the kitchen she smelled something burning, not food, not plastic, but wiring, that hot metallic stink of electricity turning dangerous. She sprinted to the stove and saw nothing wrong. But when she turned around, the Christmas lights she'd strung along the wall were flickering in a frantic rhythm, dimming and flaring like they were trying to communicate, and the outlet behind the couch was hissing. Elena grabbed a glass of water, yanked the plug, and the outlet sparked anyway, a bright blue flash that made her flinch. Smoke began to curl up in delicate threads, and suddenly she understood the terrible trap. If the calendar predicted something, it didn't mean it was coming. It meant it had already chosen you. She dragged the calendar into the bathtub with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, splashed water over it, and watched the paper warp. But the ink didn't run. It darkened, the drawings sharpening like they liked the water. Elena made a decision as ugly as panic. If it wanted fire, she would give it fire first on her terms, before it could take everything else. She lit a match and touched it to the corner, expecting paper to burn normally, slowly. But the calendar flared as if it had been soaked in gasoline, flames racing across the doors in a hungry sheet, heat blasting her face. She jerked back, and the fire leapt out of the tub, climbing the shower curtain, rolling across the bathroom like it was alive. Elena screamed, grabbed towels, slapped at the flames until her palms blistered, and finally, the sprinkler in the hallway outside her unit burst with a roar, drowning the heat in a rainstorm of freezing water. The building didn't burn down, but the firefighters still evacuated everyone, and Elena stood barefoot in the corridor, shaking so hard her teeth clicked, staring at the soggy remains in her bathtub while neighbors glared at her like she'd ruined Christmas on purpose. Later, when the smoke cleared and the walls dried, Elena went back into her bathroom and found only black pulp and warped cardboard, except for one thing that shouldn't have survived: the December 24th door, unburned, lying face up like a tongue. That night she opened it again, even though she'd already seen the drawing, because she needed to prove to herself she wasn't dreaming. Her own face stared back, X's over the eyes, flames around her head, and in the bottom corner, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, was a small penciled note in her grandmother's handwriting. "If you see this, I failed. Run before midnight." I can't include citations in this response because access to external sources isn't available in this turn, and this is an original story written for your script rather than a sourced factual account. Story 3. The Christmas Guest. By the time the stranger said Autumn's name out loud, he was already sitting in the Morrison family's living room, coat neatly folded over his knees, firelight turning his eyes a deep reflective red that made him look more like something watching through a mask than a man at all. He smiled at her, too wide, too familiar, and said, "You were 6 when you lost your favorite stuffed rabbit, weren't you? The one you dropped on the church steps after Christmas service." Autumn hadn't told that story to anyone in years. David Morrison felt the muscles in his back lock as he stood behind the couch, one hand gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles hurt. The blizzard outside threw snow against the windows in hard, icy bursts, but inside the house everything was warm, too warm, heat pressing on his skin like a fever. An hour earlier, at 11:47 p.m., the knock had come. 3 heavy blows that rattled the wreath on their front door, and Claire had looked up from the table with a frown, saying, "Who on earth would be out in this?" David had said nothing at first, because he already knew what the porch light meant. It was his rule, his tradition. Leave the light on for any weary traveler on Christmas Eve. Back then he'd believed it made him a good man. Now, 6 months after the night on Route 47, it felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. He'd almost unscrewed the bulb when he came home from work, standing on the porch with his hand on the glass, but guilt had made him leave it. God was watching, his mother would have said. Turning off the light would look like he was hiding. So he left it on, and at 11:47 p.m. something came. When David had peered through the side window before opening the door, he saw a man standing on the porch without a hat or gloves, motionless despite the wind, his hair dusted with snow. The man was smiling, not politely, not nervously, but like someone greeting an old friend. Behind David, halfway down the stairs, Autumn whispered, "Dad, why is that man smiling like he knows us?" The stranger raised his hand and waved directly at her through the glass, even though David was the only one standing in the sliver of window. That should have been enough to make him tell the man to leave. Instead, the words that came out of his mouth were the ones his own father had drilled into him. "Welcome in from the cold." He opened the door. Up close, the man didn't look like much. Mid-40s, maybe, with a long face and a kind of tiredness around the eyes that read as harmless. His coat was an old army green, too thin for the weather, and his boots were soaked. Snowflakes melted on his shoulders and didn't drip. "Evening," the stranger had said, voice smooth, almost musical. "Roads are a mess out there. I saw your porch light. Thought I'd ask for a bit of shelter till the storm lets up." Claire, polite even when she was uneasy, had stepped forward with a practiced church smile. "Of course," she'd said. "No one should be out there on a night like this." She'd taken his coat, commenting on how cold it felt, like it had been sitting outside for hours. The stranger had turned his head slowly, looking around the house, eyes lingering on the family photos along the hallway. David and Claire on their wedding day. Baby Autumn in Claire's arms. Autumn's school pictures. "Beautiful family," he said. "You must be David." Hearing his name from that mouth in that tone made David feel like someone had just read his diary out loud. He didn't remember telling him. Maybe Claire had. Maybe he hadn't been listening. That's what he told himself. They sat him by the fire. Claire made cocoa the way she always did on Christmas Eve, with too much sugar and a sprinkle of cinnamon, and the man wrapped his hands around the mug, inhaled deeply, and said, "You still make it the same way you did 3 Christmases ago, when David was in the hospital." Claire stopped stirring her own cup. Her eyes flicked to David's. That hospital stay had been for panic attacks, something he'd lied about to his co-workers, told them it was a minor surgery. Only family and a couple of doctors knew the truth. He tried to laugh. "Did we meet before?" he asked, his throat suddenly dry. The stranger smiled again, the corners of his mouth not quite matching his eyes. "We did," he said softly, "though you didn't see my face." Autumn sat on the rug near the coffee table, knees tucked to her chest, the way she did when she was trying not to show she was scared. The stranger's gaze flicked to her and softened in a way that made David's skin crawl. "You've grown," he said. "Last time I saw you, you were asleep in the back seat." The television was on but muted, some Christmas movie looping in the background, all soft lighting and laughter, a different universe entirely. The stranger glanced at it once and then back to David. "Roads must be pretty bad," David said, because silence felt worse. "You break down nearby?" The man took a sip of cocoa, closed his eyes like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted, then set the mug down with careful precision. "No," he said. "I don't drive anymore." There was something about the way he said anymore that made the room feel smaller. Claire tried again. "Are you visiting family?" she asked. "We have a guest room if you need to stay the night." The stranger tilted his head. "I am visiting family," he said, and David felt his heart stutter at the word, a wrong key pressed hard. Or something close enough. Then he turned, really turned, to look at David fully for the first time since he'd come inside. The fire shifted behind him, flaring as though someone had blown air into it. "Do you remember Route 47, David?" the man asked. The name of the road hit David like a slap. His grip on the back of the couch tightened until his fingernails dug into the wood. "Lots of roads around here," he managed. "That one runs past the river, right?" The stranger nodded slowly. Past the river. Past the old grain silos. Past the broken guardrail at mile marker 22. He said the last part gently, like a parent reminding a child of a chore. Claire frowned now, looking between them. "What is he talking about?" she asked. Autumn's eyes were wide, fixed on her father. David's mind threw up images he'd tried to bury. Headlights in rain, a dark figure in the middle of the road, the sickening thud under the car, the way his hands had shaken when he'd gripped the steering wheel, the rearview mirror showing nothing but asphalt and falling water. He'd told himself for 6 months that he'd hit debris, a deer, anything but a man. It had been raining too hard. He hadn't gone back to check. "I don't know what you mean," David lied, the words tasting like battery acid. The stranger reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded. A newspaper clipping, edges worn, print smudged. He held it up so only David could see it first, then angled it toward the light. Claire sucked in a breath. Autumn leaned forward. The headline read, "Local veteran missing after late-night walk on Route 47. There was a photo underneath. A man in an old uniform smiling awkwardly at the camera, hat slightly crooked. The name under the picture was James Patterson. The article mentioned he'd been walking to the VA hospital for an appointment. They never found a body, the guest said quietly. His kids still leave a candle in the window for him every Christmas. The fire popped loudly, making Autumn flinch. "Why are you showing us this?" Claire demanded, her voice cracking. "Who are you?" The stranger's smile thinned, then disappeared altogether. In its place was something sharper, older, like the bare structure of his face had been there all along, waiting to be seen. "I'm here because of a promise," he said. "Because on a rainy night in June, a man hit another man on Route 47 and kept driving. Because that man went home, washed the blood off his bumper, burned his clothes in a barrel behind the shed, and told himself God would understand." David's stomach lurched. He wanted to deny it, to shout that this was insane, but the words died in his chest. The guest's eyes were on him now, unblinking, reflecting the flame so intensely they seemed to glow from within. "I saw you," the stranger went on softly, "kneeling by that barrel. I heard you say you were sorry, but you never went back. You never called anyone. You left James Patterson in the dark." Claire stood up so fast her chair almost tipped. "David," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict trembling in the air. Autumn turned to her father, tears filling her eyes, confusion and betrayal fighting across her face. David opened his mouth, but his tongue felt thick, heavy. The room narrowed to the stranger's eyes, twin pinpoints of red in the dancing light. "Who are you?" David finally choked out. The man tilted his head, considering. "Some people would call me a messenger," he said. "Others would say I'm a debt collector." His smile returned, but it was different now, wider, showing too many teeth in the firelight, the shadows cutting his features into something almost animal. "You can think of me as the answer to your porch light. You invited weary travelers after all." The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, each strike landing like a hammer inside David's skull. Snow still hammered the windows, the world beyond their house erased into whiteness. The guest folded the newspaper clipping and slid it back into his pocket, then clasped his hands together as if about to say grace. "Here is what will happen," he said. "By sunrise, you will walk into the nearest police station and confess everything you did on Route 47. Every detail. No lies, no omissions. You will say the words out loud where they can't be taken back." He leaned forward slightly. The air in the room felt thin. "Or," he added calmly, "I will take your daughter instead." Claire gasped, pulling Autumn toward her, one arm around her shoulders. "You need to leave," she said, voice shaking but fierce. "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to get out of my house." The stranger did not look at her. His gaze stayed on David as if the rest of them were shadows. "This is between him and what he owes," he said quietly. "But debts have a way of spilling over." Autumn sobbed once, a small wounded sound. "Dad," she whispered, "what is he talking about?" And then, before David could answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice. The house plunged into darkness for a heartbeat, the only glow coming from the fireplace. And in that moment, David saw the guest's eyes clearly. Not just reflecting red, but emitting it. Twin coals burning in his skull. The lights buzzed back on. The guest was still seated exactly as before, but his shadow on the wall behind him wasn't right. It stretched too long, bent upward instead of sideways, rising along the wall toward the ceiling like a column of smoke. David's rational mind scrabbled for explanations. Power surge, tricks of light. But another part of him, older and smaller, curled inward and whispered one word over and over. Judgment. "You have until sunrise," the stranger repeated gently. "When the sun touches the top of the trees, your choice is sealed." He turned his head slightly toward Autumn, and the red in his eyes dimmed. "I would rather it be you, David," he added almost kindly. She had nothing to do with that night. The hours that followed blurred, stretched, twisted. Claire took Autumn upstairs, locking the bedroom door even though they all knew it wouldn't matter if the guest decided it did. Not. David paced the living room, every second marked by the relentless ticking of the mantel clock. The stranger didn't move. He didn't speak. He sat with his hands folded, staring into the fire as if watching something in the flames that only he could see. Every time David's resolve wavered, every time he thought about running instead of confessing, about waiting the night out and pretending this was some cruel hallucination, the fire would crackle and flare and the man's eyes would glow brighter, and somewhere upstairs Autumn would whimper in her sleep. At 3:12 a.m., David went to the front door and opened it. The storm hadn't calmed. Snow still swirled in thick, blinding curtains, the wind lashing his face like cold whips. He stepped onto the porch and looked down. No footprints. Not his, not the stranger's. The snow lay smooth and untouched except for one place. Right under the porch light, a melted circle where someone had stood. The bare boards wet as if from long, heavy tears. When the first gray hint of morning leaked into the sky, the world outside still buried in storm, David turned back toward the living room to tell the stranger he'd made his decision. The chair by the fire was empty. The coat was gone. The cocoa mug sat on the table untouched, the surface of the drink undisturbed as if it had been poured seconds ago. The clock read 6:59 a.m. Claire came downstairs with Autumn, eyes raw and haunted, and searched the house, opening closets, checking the guest room. Nothing. No sign anyone had ever been there. For a moment, David almost let himself believe it. Almost convinced himself that stress and guilt had finally cracked him wide open and spilled nightmares into his waking life. Then he saw the object resting on the mantel beneath the family photos. A pair of metal dog tags. Edges worn smooth, chain coiled neatly. He picked them up with numb fingers and read the name stamped into the steel. Patterson, James A. At 9:02 a.m., David walked into the police station, coat half-zipped, hair uncombed, dog tags clutched in his fists so tightly they left marks on his palm, and confessed. He told them about Route 47, about the rain, about the shape in his headlights. He told them where he'd hidden the clothes, where he'd burned them, where he'd washed the blood from the car. He expected handcuffs, expected relief, expected something to finally break inside him so he could fall apart. What he didn't expect was the confusion on the detective's face when the searches turned up nothing. No stained gravel behind the shed, no fibers, no trace. What he didn't expect was the phone call 3 days later. No body at mile marker 22, no sign anyone had ever lain in the ditch, no missing person matching James Patterson's dog tags in their system. The article he'd seen, "Local Veteran Missing," couldn't be found in any archive. It was as if the man he'd hit had never officially existed. The prosecutor still charged David with leaving the scene of an accident and obstruction. His confession was enough to build something around. In court, when they asked why he'd come forward with no evidence against him, David stared at the window, watching a pale winter sun struggle through the clouds, and said nothing. He is 3 years into a 15-year sentence now, waking up every night at 11:47 p.m., hearing phantom knocks on the cell door that no one else hears. Back at the Morrison house, Claire leaves the porch light off on Christmas Eve no matter what the neighbors say. Autumn is older, quieter, her eyes too wary for her age. Every December she tells herself she won't look out the window on Christmas Eve, that she'll ignore the feeling crawling up her spine. But when the clock hits 11:47, she always ends up standing at the edge of the curtain, peeking out into the dark. Some years there is only snow and an empty yard. Other years she swears she sees a shape at the end of the driveway. A man in an old army coat, hands in his pockets, head tilted up toward the porch light that isn't on, smiling like he's just waiting for someone to open the door and invite him in. This story is original horror fiction created for your script and not drawn from factual external sources, so it cannot be directly cited to any reference material. Current tool access is restricted this turn, which prevents attaching formal citations.